What happened inside the Ed Sullivan Theater that night was never supposed to become the biggest story in America. A president sent lawyers to silence a comedian. The comedian read the threat on live television, tore it apart with his bare hands, and dropped the pieces on his desk while the audience screamed. And by sunrise, the silence Trump tried to enforce had become the loudest conversation in the country. The theater was quiet in a way it almost never was before a taping. Not the peaceful kind of quiet that settles into a room when everything is running smoothly. The uneasy kind. The kind that hums beneath the surface when people know something has changed, but haven't been told exactly what. Crew members moved between stations with shorter steps, speaking in half sentences through their headsets. Monitors glowed behind the production wall, showing empty angles of the stage, the desk, the chair, the band setup, all of it looking perfectly normal and none of it feeling that way. The overhead lights had been set to their standard positions, warm and bright, designed to flatten shadows and make everything on stage look clean, polished, television-ready. The audience had filed in through the lobby, collected their tickets, taken their seats, settled into the familiar pre-show energy of a late-night taping in Manhattan. Phones silenced, programs folded in laps, conversations bouncing between rows in that easy, anticipatory way that comes from a crowd that already knows the rhythm of what they're about to see. A few jokes, a monologue, maybe a political bit, a guest, some laughs, credits, home. Nobody in those seats had any idea what was actually about to happen. Behind the curtain, Stephen Colbert stood holding a stack of papers thick enough to fill both hands. Not cue cards, not comedy material. Legal documents. Pages covered in dense, formal language, printed on heavy stock, delivered to the network's offices by attorneys representing the President of the United States. The pages carried the weight of institutional power compressed into ink and paper. Every paragraph designed to communicate one thing and one thing only. Stop talking. Hours earlier, the show's production team had received calls that changed the entire shape of the evening. CBS's legal department had contacted The Late Show directly, and the message was delivered without ambiguity or softness. A pre-taped interview with Texas State Representative James Tallarico, a Democratic candidate in the Texas Senate primary, could not air. The network was pulling it, not postponing it, not editing it, pulling it entirely, as if it had never been recorded. And then came the second instruction, the one that turned an unusual situation into an extraordinary one. Colbert was told he could not mention on air that the interview had been pulled. The suppression itself was to be suppressed. The silence was to be silent about its own existence. A locked door with another locked door in front of it, and behind both of them, the hope that nobody would ever know either door existed. That was the situation Colbert carried with him when the stage manager gave the signal and the curtain parted. The audience erupted the moment he appeared. The automatic reflexive wall of applause and cheers that greets a late-night host, the way a wave greets a shore, inevitable, warm, and completely unaware of what's about to change. Colbert walked toward the desk, and right away the crowd could sense something. His stride was different, not slow exactly, but measured, deliberate. The playful bounce that usually carried him from the curtain to his chair was gone, replaced by something steadier, something that moved with the gravity of a person who has already made a decision that can't be unmade. He didn't wave to the crowd the way he usually did. He didn't toss out a quick opening line to break the ice. He sat down, placed the stack of papers on the desk in front of him, squared their edges with both hands until they formed a clean, tight rectangle, and looked into the camera. The applause faded, not because someone signaled it to stop, because the room could feel, collectively and instinctively, that whatever was about to happen required silence to land properly. Colbert spoke. His voice was calm, but it carried a current underneath that the audience had never heard before. Not anger exactly, something closer to clarity, the kind of voice a person uses when they've spent hours deciding exactly what to say and have stripped every unnecessary word from the sentences until nothing remains but the thing itself. He told the audience what had happened. He said lawyers representing the president had delivered a legal threat to his network. He said they had demanded that he stop discussing certain topics on his show. He said a pre-taped interview had been pulled before it could air, and then he said the part that made the room go completely, perfectly, impossibly still. He said he had been told he couldn't even mention that the interview had been pulled. He couldn't talk about not being allowed to talk. The suppression had been designed to be invisible, to leave no trace, to create a gap in the broadcast that the audience would never notice and never question. He paused after that, not for dramatic effect, because the weight of what he had just said needed time to land. And it did. You could feel it settling into the room like something heavy being lowered onto a floor that wasn't sure it could hold it. 400 people processing the same realization at the same time. A comedian on American television had been told by the president's lawyers to be silent, and told to be silent about the silence. Then he did something that changed the energy entirely. Before going any further into the substance of what had happened, he paused and asked the viewers a simple question. Not the studio audience, the viewers at home, the ones watching through their screens, scattered across the country in living rooms and bedrooms and kitchens. Where are you watching from? It was a small moment, easy to miss if you weren't paying attention, but it was calculated with the precision of someone who understands exactly how television works. By asking that question inside the broadcast, he was creating a record. He was making the audience part of the moment. He was ensuring that whatever happened next, it happened in front of witnesses who could be counted, who could be located, who could confirm they were there when it aired. It was a comedian's version of taking attendance before saying something that could not be taken back. Then he picked up the legal documents from the desk and began to read. He read the claims aloud, slowly. Every sentence given its full weight, every legal phrase pronounced clearly enough for anyone watching to understand exactly what was being said. According to the letter, his jokes and commentary were damaging the president's reputation. His segments were spreading false narratives. His show was engaging in a pattern of harmful speech that constituted grounds for legal action if it did not stop immediately. The language was heavy, formal, constructed by people who build sentences the way engineers build bridges. Every word load-bearing, every clause reinforced with precedent and implied consequence. The kind of language designed to make the person receiving it feel small, isolated, and outmatched. The kind of language that assumes the reader will fold under the weight of it and quietly comply because fighting back costs more than silence. But Colbert didn't read it like a man who had folded. He read it like a man holding something up to sunlight so everyone could see what it was actually made of. By stripping the words from their private, intimidating context and placing them into the public, transparent space of a television broadcast, he reversed their function completely. The language that was designed to silence became, in his hands, the loudest argument for why he should keep speaking. He set the letter down and addressed the camera directly. The comedy was gone now. Not absent exactly, but temporarily set aside, placed on a shelf where it could watch from a distance while something more fundamental took its place. He said public figures are criticized. That's how democracy works. Presidents, senators, governors, mayors, every person who steps into public power steps into public scrutiny. They get mocked, they get challenged, they get satirized, parodied, questioned, and yes, sometimes unfairly attacked. That's the cost of the position. That's the price of the power. And that price has been understood and accepted by every leader in every free society, for as long as free societies have existed. Trying to silence a comedian with a legal threat, he said, doesn't just raise questions about one show or one joke or one segment. It raises questions about the principle underneath all of it. The principle that says speech in a democracy does not require permission from the person being spoken about. That criticism does not need approval from its target to exist. That laughter, even uncomfortable laughter, even sharp laughter, even laughter that lands exactly where the powerful don't want it to land, is protected not because it's polite, but because it's necessary. The room was so quiet you could hear the hum of the stage lights. The audience wasn't breathing in unison, but it felt like they were. Every face in the studio was locked on the man behind the desk, watching something happen that they knew, even in the moment, they would remember for a very long time. He talked about the pattern, not just this letter, the larger pattern that the letter fit into. The years of Trump calling critics low IQ, the attacks on journalists, comedians, political rivals, anyone who held up a mirror and showed the reflection he didn't want the public to see. The constant insistence that he was a genius, the smartest, the best educated, the most brilliant mind in any room he entered, and then, in direct, stark, unavoidable contrast, the legal threats to keep his actual academic records permanently sealed. The genius who didn't want anyone to see his grades. The top of the class who hired lawyers to lock the transcripts in a vault. And then there was the other thread, the one that made the legal threat feel less like routine political defensiveness and more like something urgent. Something protective, something that needed the jokes to stop, not because they were false, but because they were getting close to something that couldn't survive sustained public attention. The documented connections with Jeffrey Epstein, the photographs that existed in public archives, the quotes that had been recorded and published and never successfully denied, the social history that kept overlapping in ways that simple acquaintance couldn't explain away. Critics had been pointing to these connections for years, and every time they surfaced, the response followed the same pattern. Not engagement, not explanation, not the calm, confident correction that a person gives when they have nothing to hide. Attack, deflect, threaten, bury, every single time. Colbert connected these threads with the patience of someone weaving a rope they intend to be strong enough to hold weight. He didn't accuse, he didn't speculate. He simply placed the pieces next to each other and let the proximity do the work. A man who calls himself a genius but hides his grades. A man who insists he has nothing to hide but sends lawyers to stop people from looking. A man who dismisses questions about Epstein with anger instead of answers. A man who doesn't correct the record but tries to destroy the person holding it. He asked the question that made the entire studio draw the same breath at the same time. If the jokes are false, why not correct them? If the commentary is wrong, why not prove it? Why send lawyers? Why demand silence? Why try to make the entire conversation disappear, unless the conversation is approaching something that can't survive in the open? He let the question hang in the air, didn't answer it himself, didn't need to. The silence where the answer should have been said more than any sentence could have. Then he picked up the letter one final time. He held it in both hands. The pages clearly visible to every camera in the room, the dense legal text, the formal headers, the weight of institutional power compressed into ink and paper. He looked at it for a long moment, not reading it anymore, just holding it, measuring it, deciding something that the audience could feel building in the stillness of the room the way pressure builds before a storm breaks. Then he tore it in half. The sound of paper splitting filled the studio the way a crack fills a frozen lake. Sharp, sudden, and final. His hands pulled in opposite directions, the thick pages resisting for a fraction of a second before giving way, the carefully constructed legal language separating into fragments that no longer carried threat, no longer formed sentences, no longer meant anything at all, except that someone had tried to use power to enforce silence, and the silence had refused to hold. He dropped the pieces onto the desk. They fell in a scattered pile across the polished surface, edges ragged, words broken, paragraphs turned to confetti, the physical remains of an attempt at intimidation, lying in pieces under studio lights while 400 people watched and millions more would watch before the sun came up. The audience detonated. The sound that erupted from that room was not applause in any ordinary sense. It was a release. A collective, physical, almost involuntary eruption of sound that carried relief, defiance, recognition, and something that felt like gratitude, all wrapped into a single roar that hit the stage like a wall of wind. People were on their feet before they consciously decided to stand. Some were clapping so hard their hands burned. Others were shouting words that got lost in the wave of noise, but didn't need to be heard individually to be understood. Colbert stood behind the desk and let it come. He didn't perform into the moment. He didn't raise a fist or pump the air or play the hero. He just stood there, steady, the torn pages at his fingertips, and let the reaction say the thing that no single person in that room could have said alone, but that all of them together said perfectly. When the noise finally began to settle, when the standing turned back to sitting, and the shouting turned back to breathing, and the room found something close to its normal frequency again, Colbert spoke one more time, quietly, almost gently, the way a person speaks when they want every word to land individually, each one carrying its own weight, each one placed with the kind of care that means they've been chosen from 1,000 possibilities and survived every cut. He pointed out what happens when powerful people try to silence public criticism. He said the pattern is ancient, and the outcome is almost always the same. The attempt to suppress becomes a bigger story than whatever was being suppressed. The letter intended to bury a conversation becomes the headline of the conversation. The demand for silence generates more noise than the original speech ever could have produced on its own. And he added the detail that cut deepest of all. He said if an actual defamation case were ever to move forward, if Trump's lawyers were to follow through on the threat and take this into a courtroom, the legal process would require something called discovery. And discovery means documents become public, records become evidence, communications get subpoenaed. The very things the legal threat was designed to protect, the very things the silence was designed to keep buried, could end up spread across a courtroom table under fluorescent lights while cameras rolled and the whole country watched. He let the irony sit there without underlining it. A man sending lawyers to stop people from talking about things he insists aren't true, while the legal mechanism he's threatening to use is the one mechanism in the American system most likely to force those exact things into public view. By the time the show ended and the studio lights began to cool, the clips were already moving, not spreading, moving, with the kind of velocity that only happens when something hits a nerve that was already exposed. Television news had the footage within the hour. Morning shows were planning segments before midnight. Social media turned the torn pages into an image that carried more meaning than any press release or official statement could have competed with. By sunrise, the segment dominated every platform. The cease and desist letter that was designed to end a conversation had instead started the biggest conversation of the entire week. What was intended as a quiet act of legal intimidation, delivered behind closed doors, processed through network lawyers, designed to leave no trace, had become one of the most visible, most discussed, most replayed moments of the year. Supporters of the show called it a defense of everything satire is supposed to be in a free society. Critics debated the line between comedy and political activism, between entertainment and accountability, between the right to speak and the weight of the platform. Analysts dissected the legal strategy, the public relations disaster, the cultural implications, and across every conversation, every take, every reaction, one image kept recurring. A man behind a desk, holding a legal threat in his hands, and choosing to tear it apart on live television rather than let it do what it was designed to do. Because in the end, the moment was never just about a comedian or a president or a letter or a network. It was about the oldest question in the relationship between power and speech. What happens when someone who has the authority to demand silence meets someone who has the ability to refuse it? What happens when the instrument of intimidation is held up to the light and the audience gets to see it for what it actually is? What happens when the thing that was supposed to make someone afraid becomes, instead, the reason they decide to be brave? The answer was lying in pieces on a late-night desk, torn in half. Under studio lights, in front of the whole country, and the sound of that paper ripping, it was still echoing the next morning, still echoing the next week, still echoing long after the lawyers went quiet and the headlines moved on, because some sounds don't fade when the broadcast ends. They settle into the culture like a crack in a foundation, small enough to ignore if you want to, impossible to unsee once you've looked. If this moment made your pulse jump, hit subscribe and ring that bell. These are not just late-night segments. They are the moments where the line between power and resistance becomes visible, and the whole country gets to decide which side of it they want to stand on. Drop a comment and tell us which part made you hold your breath. And stay close, because the next one pulls back a curtain that nobody in Washington wants opened.